Please join me this morning on, again, a very exciting occasion for us as Claretian missionaries, but really for all of those interested and involved in ministry in the church, in the history of migrants and migrant communities, and so many other implications of Deborah's work. So please join me in welcoming Deborah Kantor, the author of Pioneers of Latino Ministry. Give a round of applause, but don't come up yet. She's also fresh off of speaking to the Spanish-speaking deacons for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and it'll be interesting to hear some of her other engagements and presentations. Deborah is a professor emeritus of history at Albion College in Michigan, a Chicago native. She lived and worked in Mexico for over 4 years. She's also the author of several books, including Chicago Católico, Making Catholic Parishes Mexican, and Hijos del Pueblo, Gender, Family, and Community in Rural Mexico. We are very honored to have her with us today as she shares her work and her insights.
Thank you. Okay. This is so wonderful to be with you all this morning. The sun's shining. This is good. And it feels a little bit like the scene of the crime because for 3 years on an office, my office was basically this corner 2 floors below. So looking out the window is very familiar. And whenever the documents got to be too much, it was always fun to look down at the L or whatever. And I loved working in this building. So my game plan for today is I'm going to talk for around 30 minutes, and I would love to leave time for questions and for visiting. So, and are we good with sound? We're okay, right? Okay. Okay, so I want to start off with some thank yous, and the initial thank you goes to the archivists, without whom there would be no research and there would be no books. And the first archivist, well, actually, you know what? I started working in the archives here in like 2001 on my first book. And while I was working on that first book, I got to meet Malachi McCarthy, retired archivist for the Claretians. And Malachi and Father Rosendo were the ones who kind of came up with this project. And I also like thinking about initial work that people did, the work that Malachi McCarthy did with Brother Dan Magner, the volume, The Claretians in America, Pictorial History, was so helpful in getting me sort of a basic timeline and thinking about places and people that I might want to write about. But there's the current archivist. So, and with us today, we have Doris Cardenas, the head archivist, who has now been with me on 2 projects. And I feel so blessed to have worked with her. When I'm like, I need this reference in this volume from 1901, and it might be on page 400 or it might be on page 405, and it's in Spanish. She comes up with these things. It's great. And the team that Doris works with, Krista Melkonian and Jesse Kuntz, have also been remarkably helpful in the conversations that I had when I was working with them, or times that I would do phone calls, was invaluable in sort of keeping me going. The Claretians entrusted me to tell their story. So this started with Father Rosendo, and then as I traveled throughout the country to current and historic Claretian communities, I met current Claretians who introduced me to lay people in their parishes, and we had conversations about people's experiences, and I was like, Father Steve, I need a picture from OLG, and I think you sent me one, and you saved me, so I don't have to drive back to Chicago. Also, the Claretian Alumni Association has been very kind and inclusive. They let me attend an online 3-hour-long reunion, and I was the only outsider who was allowed to attend. And all the great people who work in this building who have made my work so much easier. Connie, Sandra, Gail, Maria, and the people who helped make today possible, Sandra and Karen. So thanks for making such a nice event. And last but not least, for the thank yous, my husband Dan, who is, say hi to him, he's at the book table. So he's been remarkably kind to me in the last 4 years. And he's like, shouldn't we go on a vacation to such and such? And I'm like, no, my book is due in 2 years, so I need to be working on the book. And he's just been remarkably patient and like continues to be so interested in this project. And he got me my Camp Claret patch. So, because did you know the Claretians had a summer camp in Illinois? They did. Okay, so a little bit about myself. Where am I aiming this? I'm aiming this. Oh. There we go. Okay, I'm new with the tech here. So a little bit about myself. So I am a historian, and the sort of first step that got me kind of to this project was doing the research on Chicago's Mexican Catholic churches. And the first half of that book, I used the case study of what happened at St. Francis of Assisi, which is still standing. It's like the only thing left standing in the UIC neighborhood. It's at Roosevelt Road and Newberry. And so that was a Claretian-run parish from about 1927 to the late 1990s. And so in order to tell that story, that's why I started coming to the archive in this building. And I started sort of following some personalities who worked at St. Francis of Assisi who were Claretians, and kind of wondered about these people and the places that they worked outside of Chicago. And a man whose story kept coming up over and over again. And if you bring up his name in LA or in New Jersey or definitely in Chicago, everybody has a Father Thomas Matten story. Just a couple snapshots from the rectory at St. Francis of Assisi. So anybody who's grew up in a Mexican-American or Mexican family knows who's got his hand on Father Thomas's shoulder. That's the Mexican movie star ranchero singer Pedro Infante, who kept coming for events at St. Francis of Assisi, and like, what's with that body language, right? So I was like, who is this Father Thomas Matten? What's like Pedro Infante? What is going on here? And when Pedro Infante died, by the way, in Mexico City, well, he dies in a plane crash. I think it's 57. There's like hundreds of thousands of people out on the street, and there were like riots, and it was like insanity. This guy was like, he was sort of an Elvis in a way. And anyways, but he used to come like on a pretty regular basis to St. Francis, and there was some connection with Father Thomas. Most of the pictures from the rectory at St. Francis are of the group of clergy who lived there, right? Well, here's Father Thomas, and who's he sitting down with? He's sitting with Mexican workers who had arrived in the neighborhood, so it was pretty close to the train yards, and they often would send young men from the parish down and bring them back, get them meals. They could like sleep in an empty room in the church or whatever. And so there were a lot of curious things, and I knew that Father Thomas had worked in some mysterious place called Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And I was like, what is that? And it was always a story I wanted to tell. And so Father Thomas is kind of part of how I get interested in this project. And then there were so many more characters whose stories I uncovered and kind of was fascinated and fell in love with. In the end, what I wrote is the first book-length history of the Claretians in the United States. So there's book-length histories in Spanish about the Claretians, often published in Spain, but really nothing book length about their work in the United States. They arrived here in 1902. When I agreed to work on this project, I decided that I was going to focus it on the Claretians and their work with Latino Ministry. Here's an example of one of those places, a little tiny town, Martindale, Texas, like a town of, there's one blinking light. It's that kind of a town, right? And this is near San Marcos. And so why did I want to focus on places like Martindale, Texas, and Our Lady of Guadalupe in South Chicago? Let me read a teensy bit from the book. Few Americans had ever heard of Claret or the Claretians when the first two missionaries arrived in 1902, barely able to communicate in English. The Claretian newcomers demonstrated energy and vision as they plunged into ministry to the poor, to immigrants, and particularly to the Mexican population. As that population moved to urban areas, they established parishes in Arizona, California, and Illinois, and eventually across the country. Indeed, the Claretians pioneered Latino ministry in the U.S., especially because they were native Spanish speakers. They were Spaniards. They became particularly involved with Latino communities, though they also ministered to other groups. When those first Claretians arrived in the United States, Spanish-speaking Catholics were barely recognized by the American church as a whole. But today, Latinos make up about half of United States Catholics, and for this reason, the influence of the Claretians has been felt amongst the American Catholic population as a whole, given the high proportion of U.S. Catholics who have been connected to the Claretians. Beyond church walls, Claretian missionaries have advocated for the rights of immigrants, workers, and the poor. For example, Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers organized out of a Claretian church basement in East LA. In cities across the country, they have defended neighborhoods in the face of deindustrialization, urban renewal, and depopulation. This book makes the case that understanding the Claretians is important to understanding Latino Catholicism and Latino Catholic life, as well as the history of American Catholics more broadly. And so my big argument in the book is that the Claretians' accompaniment, and that's a big word in this book, the Claretians' accompaniment of Hispanic Catholics stands out as a continuity in over 120 years of work in the United States. This is a map which is no longer online, and this gives you a little sense of the historic presence of the Claretians in the United States. So if we look at places where they worked long-term, maybe 30 places in the United States where they either had junior seminaries long-term for maybe 40 years, or places where they had long-term parishes. And so some of those long-term places, San Antonio, Perth Amboy, Fresno, San Gabriel, California, and Our Lady of Guadalupe, right here in Chicago. And I got really interested in the places where the Claretians were there for like 3 years or 5 months. And there were some crazy stories that came up about this. For example, if you can find Kansas on that map, I probably cannot. I get a little lost after Iowa. So somewhere between Iowa and California, I don't know. But Dodge City, Kansas. I was like, huh? They were in Dodge City, Kansas for 1 year. And they got brought in to work with traqueros, with Mexican railway workers. There was this desire, and they were invited in by the Diocese of Wichita, which all of a sudden meant I had to do research on the Diocese of Wichita. So, and Dodge City, Kansas, which, it started off with the Mexican Catholics living inside a railway camp, houses made out of discarded railroad ties and this and that. There's a cathedral now in Dodge City, Kansas, and you know what the cathedral's called? Our Lady of Guadalupe. The Claretians were there like 1911 to 1912, but they clearly built something that stabilized things and got things going. Another very brief period, the Claretians first go to New Jersey in 1945, the summer of 45. The war is just about over. Why do they go there? To work with the Mexican railroad braceros, the contracted temporary workers who were keeping the railways going across the United States. And it was the famous Father Tort, who I think may come up in my talk. He heard there were these Mexican railway workers and there was nobody ministering to them. And so he goes out there. And then Father Sevi Lopez, a Chicago Mexican-American priest from the Claretians, went. So that's their introduction to New Jersey. And then they have to leave because the braceros get sent back to Mexico. And but they're like, Spanish speakers are showing up nearby. I wonder if we can set something up. And they're in Perth Amboy today, very, very much. I got super interested in the stories of some of these individuals, especially, I paid attention to everybody, but I really loved being able to uncover the stories of Hispanic vocations. So, because it's one of my arguments in the book is that the Claretians, probably more than any order historically, were bringing Hispanic, mostly Mexican-American men. They were training them at seminary, and a good number of them were going on into the priesthood or as brothers. And I think that this is something that the Claretians really can be proud of. I think they were way ahead of the game by at least a full generation. Can't remember what captions I put. Immaculate Heart of Mary Church in San Antonio, which the Claretians have had as a parish for like 110 years, and they're still there. And this is like really quite close to downtown San Antonio. So I want to talk just a second about the method of how I did the research for this book. And why are all these people at banquet tables in 1939? That's because they're celebrating the ordination and first Mass by one of their own, a boy who had grown up at IHM Parish, a boy named Robert Alvarado. Way in the back of the stage are the Claretians. And what I love about this photograph is we get to see how Robert Alvarado, he was a Claretian, but he was part of this community. This was the first priest to come out of this parish. And like people are like really enjoying being there. And the fact that they had a church hall meant they had a place to celebrate. And that's something I find over and over again with the stories of building these initial parishes, that having a place to gather was such a game changer for people. So the kind of history that I do, a lot of Catholic history we might call top down. It is kind of a hierarchical church. There's the Pope, and there's bishops, and then priests run parishes. Well, the kind of history I like to do would not be top down. Maybe I'm an anti-Catholic historian. I like to do a bottom-up history. I like to think about the people whose stories are not recorded and the ways that their lives worked. And in the end, the way I like to tell this history is I like to think about not really top down, not exactly bottom up, but that the church hierarchy, parish priests, bishops, and lay people, that they influenced each other. And it's all over my Chicago Católico book, and I think it's pretty present here. So this book puts the Claretian Missionaries and Latino laity both understudied into the same frame. In contrast to most histories of Catholic religious, I bring lay people to the fore where relevant. The Claretians were intimately linked to the Mexican and other Latino people they served. They carried out missions and created parishes in marginalized communities whose histories deserve telling. Claretian sources offer windows into Latino life, from Arizona mining towns to Chicago's steel barrio, from Oregon farms to New Jersey factory towns. In terms of the surprises I ran into in doing this research, and especially in the writing up, where I had time to sort of like stop and really ponder the patterns that were kind of coming to the surface, is I decided that this book about Latino ministry actually paralleled so many things that were going on in U.S. Catholic history. And I was like, okay, it's not a separate story, Latino Catholics, American Catholics. It's like there are these many points of intersection. And so what I want to share with you briefly is some ways in which Claretian work in the United States was very much part and parcel of what was going on in the larger evolution of Catholic America. And one of those things would be in the centrality of parish life, especially, back in the days when most Catholics in America were urban Catholics. So just to give you a little bite, a little taste. So we're back at Immaculate Heart of Mary Church, where Robert Alvarado came out of. And these are the ushers from the 1930s. Ushers was the word they used in Spanish for ushers. So men, probably mostly married men. They're wearing their little pins that indicate that they are ushers. These were very much working class, blue collar guys. And look what happened on Sunday. They're all dressed up. And it was their job to help people to their seats and to collect the collecta for the parish. And among the people who are in this photograph, at least one of them is the father of Father Luis Olivares, who, as far as I know, is the only Claretian to receive an obituary in the New York Times. He was a really remarkable figure in Los Angeles, nationally known, really one of the people who spearheaded sanctuary the first time around in the 1980s in the United States. So he was a boy who grew up at this parish, and his father and mother were very involved. Another snippet of parish life. We go across the country to Perth Amboy. There's my guy, Father Thomas, in the Panama hat in the middle. One of the things that why I really wanted to study Perth Amboy was I had all this stuff about the Claretians working with Mexicanos. Well, that was not who was in Perth Amboy. So if you've been there, that was not who was in Perth Amboy. So really the biggest wave of Hispanos who were coming in the late 40s and 50s were from Puerto Rico. And then later on, you start getting a lot of people from Dominican Republic. And today, it's a very mixed Latin American parish. It's really very striking. And so these are mostly Puerto Rican school kids who are coming to summer, vacation Catholic school. And every year it was there were more and more kids because it was just this incredible wave after wave of people arriving from Puerto Rico to Perth Amboy, and most of them end up with Our Lady of Fatima, the Claretian parish that emerges in the 50s and 60s. Another way in which the Claretians' work mirrors what's going on in larger Catholic America is with the incredible building and growth of seminaries. So there's a lot of people who are interested in religious life in the early 20th century and mid-20th century, kind of going up until about 1965, and things changed. So this is Dominguez Seminary in Carson, California. And there are many reasons why I love this photograph. And you can date this photo, right? Without knowing what date it is. If you look at the guy in the center, Father Leonard Cuellar, he was a chaplain. He was a Claretian, and he was a chaplain in World War II. He served in North Africa and Italy. And he didn't send a lot of letters back to the Claretians because he was busy. And I think he had a very rough ministry following along with that campaign. Anyway, so here he is visiting his alma mater. He was one of the first Hispanic Claretians to be trained in the United States. But look at the incredible number of young men who were in formation. I don't know, is this 42, 45? It's something like that. And maybe about 1 out of 5 of them were actually Hispanic surnamed. So again, we get to see those great numbers. Yeah, a little closer to home. Moments. Have you been to a picnic there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so back in the day, a lot of...
10 buses.
10 buses, okay, from St. Francis. And it was an incredibly popular place for picnics for the people involved with the St. Jude Police League. So coming out of the St. Jude devotion. So, I mean, in that case, with the police league, there were probably 7,000 to 10,000 people who would descend on the seminary, which had 45 acres maybe. So there was room for these picnickers to come. Anyway, so they sort of took a chance. It's the middle of the Depression. There's no money anywhere, right? And they decide we need to have a junior seminary in this part of the country. And part of this is the guys, the men who are members of the police league like this, but the Claretians themselves very much have this sense of expansion. And so I love, it's like dried corn in the background. This is where they built the seminary. Like if you build it, they will come, right? This is like the baseball field. We've got this bishop there in his vestments. He was a Claretian, Father Preciado. He was a bishop in Panama, and he would come up every year to the United States, and he'd go on like a 6-month tour. He didn't really go on like tours like that in Panama, but whatever. He'd, come up. First, it was like on the banana boat from the United Fruit Company, and he'd come to New Orleans and go to Texas. He'd get on the train. He'd go to California. He'd come to Chicago. He'd baptize every Hispanic kid in the United States. Not baptize, confirm. Sorry. And he would visit the seminaries, and he would tell stories about doing missionary work in Panama. And so this got the attention of a lot of these boys. It's a junior seminary. They're like ages 12 to about 18. So they're pretty, what's the word? They're like open books. So one of the teens who heard Bishop Preciado was 14-year-old Albert Daub, who was a Chicagoan. And he wrote about the experience of listening to the bishop. We enjoyed every word of both the archbishop. We retired that night thinking of all the trials and sufferings that one must experience in the life of a missionary priest. Okay? So, it's like, this is the stuff you find in the archive in this building. It is kind of amazing that we have this story. What happens to to Albert Daub? He continues through seminary. He actually gets ordained in Chile. He sort of had this early focus, I think, on Latin America. A little bit more about Daub. So I think a lot of people in this room know this window. It's in the back on the left-hand side at Our Lady of Guadalupe in South Chicago. So we have Claret, but the window donated by the Father Daub Missionary Club. Father Daub was in his first position. He was doing youth ministry in San Antonio in the late 40s. They go on a picnic, the young folks. It was a Newman Club at a high school, and there were boating accidents. And he went in to save some of the young people he was working with. He saved the first one, but the next time he drowned himself. He was the first American Claretian to pass away, 49 maybe. So, and when he died, the Mexican Shoeshine Boys of San Antonio did an honor guard for his funeral procession because he was always reaching out to them. Daub is a good example of the ways that many young American men, Anglo-American or Hispanic, they were really drawn to missionary work. And this idea of exotic foreign missionary work was the stuff that really got their attention. And so a lot of people get involved with the Claretians. I think that they think they're going to China and they think they're going to Panama, and instead their mission ended up being places like Yuma, Arizona, or back of the yards in Chicago. So, and it is a topic I talk about throughout this book, the way 13-year-olds and the mothers and fathers of 13-year-olds make certain decisions, and people don't really have full stories. But there's this incredible attraction of missionary work. Little bit there, the bishop in Panama. 3 Claretian priests who were all Chicagoans, all trained at St. Jude Seminary in Moments, and they went to Eastern Guatemala in 1966. And the Claretians were there for like 30 years. And it was one of the most amazing chapters to write in this book. It's pretty hard from the materials to argue. I mean, like, they built the church there. And I don't mean like brick and mortar, although there was some of that. But, like in terms of like building up the laity and building up capacity, literacy, midwifery, catechists, right? And then some of this intersects in the early 1980s with the military violence that was going on in Guatemala. And there were Guatemalan, especially indigenous people, who worked hand in hand with the Claretians, who were among the martyred people in Guatemala. And those records are all downstairs. And I'm in touch with the current parish priest there, not a Claretian, a Maltese priest, and we've been able to put things together from stuff he has from families there and stuff that I was able to find here. This interest in foreign missionary work was not unique to the Claretians. So here's, sort of your typical Chicago Catholic school classroom from the early 1960s, St. Mary's School, 1962. Anybody? Okay, Ellen Scarrett recognizes this photograph. Anybody else recognize the photograph? Huh, you guys didn't read your papers this summer. This is Pope Leo's childhood parish, right? St. Mary's. So, when the news came out about the selection of Pope Leo, my friends across the country are all like, messaging me like, what is this? About Chicago, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, the reason I could, how does he end up like going to Peru? Why does he become a bishop? Well, I had written the section in this book that explained why people went to Guatemala and the impact they had. And so I think I can kind of tell the Pope Leo story through the lens of the Augustinians, a parallel order with the Claretians. He also came up through junior seminary, and his order was quite involved in Peru. Another way in which the Claretians' story mirrors the larger story of American Catholics is that these sort of great numbers of Catholic religious, of men and women, going straight up into the early 1960s, it becomes this incredible story of decline right around 1966. St. Jude Seminary was enrolling its biggest classes in like 63 and 64. They didn't quite know where to put all the boys, right? They closed it in 1969 or 1970. It was like the enrollment just bottomed out. And so there's this great crisis amongst the Claretians and among all of the religious orders and among the female religious orders and amongst diocesan clergy of how are we going to staff things? What's going on here? So the Claretians are really sort of searching for ways, to continue to recruit new people into the congregation. They don't even take. They look for older vocations. They look for men, who've already maybe had something of a career, men who have already gone to college, maybe at a secular institution, and they really begin, like, let's work with that gift of somebody who is more experienced as opposed to the 13, 14-year-olds. And in the end, if we sort of fast forward, I think what's going on with the Claretians and with U.S. Catholic clergy in general is we have something we might call for the last 20 years, and definitely today, mission in reverse of men and women coming from the global south little example close to home. I think only like half the people in this picture are in this room right now. So this is from Casa Claret, the Claretians Formation residence in Hyde Park. A photo from August, a service of renewal of vows. And we have people here who are from India, people who are from China, people who are from Cameroon. Yeah. Okay, gotcha. This is the future of the Claretians in the United States. And when I started this research 4 years ago, I had no idea. I thought it was going to be a story of how do Spanish priests do this ministry in the United States, and how do you get American priests, and how does everybody work with Hispanics? And it becomes, if you look at this sort of current day chapter, it's like a more complex story, but not unique to the Claretians. So. Okay, and I'm going to wrap up here. No idea how I'm doing on time, but I am going to wrap up. Okay, so I argued throughout this book that what distinguishes the Claretians is their accompaniment of Latino Catholics. The commitment makes them distinct in American Catholic history. The Claretians followed the migrations of misunderstood, vulnerable, and often maligned Spanish-speaking people. When the rest of America barely recognized Latino people who worked the lowest paid jobs in the fields, in the mines or steel mills, and raised families in shacks and boxcars, the Claretians maintained a steady, supportive presence. Bishop Placido shares, "We were following, ministering to Mexicans. We were the only ones who accompanied them." Think acompañamiento, as Pope Francis urges. And Bishop Placido went on further. The Claretians, we developed Hispanic ministry and handed it to the larger church. When many dioceses ignored the Católicos in their midst, the Claretians accompanied them wherever possible. Okay. And what do we got here? And by the way, this quote came from the day I pushed myself into a visit at the residence, the Provincial House in Oak Park, to meet with Father Mark Brummel and Placido. I sort of interviewed them together. And he spat this out, and I managed to write it down. I don't really know. So it was like, I was getting to the end of doing the research. I was like, wow, this ties a lot of things together. Okay, so that's kind of it. Little bit the cover of the book. This came up at the very end. This came out of the team at New York University Press. The first 3 covers they gave me were really off, and I hated them. And I was like, I should be so glad they're just publishing the book. I shouldn't push back. But I was like, I'm uncomfortable with those photographs. And then this was the 4th idea. And I knew who this was, Father Joseph Puigui, who worked at St. Francis and at St. Jude Seminary. This is a photograph of a Mexican Catholic community in Clyde, Wisconsin. So Clyde, Wisconsin, I don't know, blinking light maybe. A little town on the edge of the Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin. If you have any friends in the Diocese of Madison, tell them about the book. I kind of can't get anybody in Wisconsin interested in the fact that Mexican Wisconsin is on the cover of this book. So I don't know what's going, and it's weird, Clyde, the parish there, is overseen, weirdly, by Spaniards. Which, I wrote to them and I was like, oh, what could you tell me about this photograph? So, anyways, it continues. You can get this book from any online seller. You can buy it directly from New York University Press. I have cards in the back with the discount code. You can get it at 30% off. Yes? No? Or you...
It's also about the same. Just want to remind people, you're also offering a discount here.
Yeah. So, anybody wants to reach out, please send me an email. Those of you who work in parish ministry or your friends who are spread out across the country, I would love to go out to the parishes and share the stories of individual parishes. You guys want to invite me to OLG? I'm there. So I have a lot on the early years of OLG in this book. And I would, I feel like it's a great gift to give back the story of these sort of very early years at the parishes. So that's what I have formally for you all. Thank you. Any questions?
Can I have a comment?
Yeah, and our commenter here is Elena Duran, who came into St. Francis of Assisi Parish in the early 1960s. Is that correct? Yes. And I had the incredible fortune to interview Elena for my last book, Chicago Católico, and here she is back.
Well, as I was reading your book, Chicago Católico,
Yeah.
I actually had to put it down many times because what happened back in 1916, the idea of us not being welcome neither by the church or by the government, and we were here. They were already here. And so I'm reading the book and I had to put it down. I just couldn't keep reading it. And then I remember when I came in 64, November of 64, and went to St. Francis. Of course, it was la Catedral de los Hispanos in Chicago. That's how we call it. Because everybody from the Chicagoland area attended St. Francis. Because there were no other churches that would have masses in Spanish, besides South Chicago, of course. And so to us, we were not second-class citizens. We were not second-class citizens where they would have a mass, supposedly, giving us a favor, some parishes.
In a basement. Yeah.
So I refused to attend a mass. I don't know how to pray in English because I didn't want to go to churches. They saw me as a second-class Catholic. So it's kind of anger that I, project. But I'm here because of the Claretians. Because to us in St. Francis, we spoke Spanish. It was our parish. They were not being patronizing. They were not being condescending. They were mostly Spaniards. We had Father Bianchi, which is Italian, Father Mishki, Polish, and then some Mexican, priests too. But they saw us as we had the commonality of the Spanish. It was our language, but the Claretians saw us as great people, and that's why you see the respect. La Juventud Obrera Católica, which I was part of, and we call ourselves Josistas, and we are Josistas for life. So Father Peter Rodriguez was our leader. And our meetings on Wednesdays, the average will be like 30 youth, 30 young people. We were all, like you mentioned in your book, we were all like workers. We work in factories. There were some that were students that were already to college. They were in high schools maybe. But we were all working in factories. But to us, we would take buses to get to St. Francis. There were not a lot of people that had cars. But, so you understand how, and I will speak only for St. Francis, because I don't think I've ever been in Armenia, Guadalupe, in South Chicago. But I will speak for St. Francis. When I mentioned the buses, there was the most incredible thing you ever seen in your life, because they were the big buses, not the school buses. And to us, there was our center, and I'm writing my book, my history in Spanish. And I mentioned St. Francis, I mentioned the Claretians, and I mentioned that to us, it was our universe. St. Francis and the Claretians were our universe. With all the upheaval, with all the things that was going on with the Democratic Convention and all of that, we were totally Far from it, because it had nothing to do with us. You know, it was like white people having issues, had nothing to do with us. And I will put that in my book too. It is like that, but it was, I just wanted to understand what you wrote about it is us. It was a history, our history of the Mexicans here. And they were our spiritual guides. When we used to have the missionaries, one came from Japan, another one from the Philippines. They would come and they would give us in our reuniones, our meetings on Wednesdays. The Father Peter was the one that was our leader, right? And so we ran the meeting. We prepared the agenda. We wrote we had all the topics we put it together. Father Peter would sit and speak at the end of our meeting. He would not speak before. We would not allow them to speak. He would want it that way. So we became the leaders of our communities. And our mass was the third Sunday of the month. And there was like 100. You have a picture of our choir. We were like more than 100 cosistas in our mass. And it was just that group. Then you had the ladies, the other groups. In Santo Nombre, there were more than 100 men in that group. You've never seen anything up until, I don't think here in Chicago, ever. You've never seen what happened in St. Francis. Because we were everywhere. John Cody wanted to get rid of St. Francis, and we wanted to show him that they wanted to close St. Francis. And this is back in the late 60s, and so we had to prove to him that this was a vital community. And what we did, they said, okay, we have to show him. So it was a mass that he attended, but when the people stood up for communion, they were like, I don't know if it was maybe 8 priests or 6 giving communion, because the lines of people would not end. And he says, well, how could I close this parish? How could we close this building? And so we had to prove it. So to us, and you said it in your book, and I'm a big fan of your work, because that's the history of the Mexicans, and you clarify, you specify, and we had a good Puerto Rican group in St. Francis, but you spoke about us, and there was a respect there.
And Elena, I think exactly what you're sharing, these memories, it kind of, this is your lived experience, but it also ties together with how I approach telling this story. This is not about priests telling people what to do. It's about the community and priests influencing each other. This is it's a super powerful example of that. So I wanted to share that with you. And I think that your experience there, I think that there were similar things happening, definitely in Los Angeles, in Perth Amboy, probably in San Antonio. So, and some of that is coming up in the early 60s in these urban parishes, because the Claretians are very big advocates of cursillo, and there's many, dozens or hundreds of people at these parish who are participating in cursillo and coming to understand how their lived Catholicism can be so much more. And they're often being, really green-lighted to do that by their Claretian priests, not by all of them. So,
but I think the difference of Chicago, and we are unique. We were unique. It was that even though, I will say San Antonio was more Mexican Americans, they consider them like Texans, you know what I mean? So, but here in Chicago, the majority of us, we were Mexicans that had just came from Mexico recently, right? Throughout the waves that happened. So there was a difference, that in St. Francis was only one mass in English on Sundays, only one. They were all Spanish.
Yeah.
So to us at the time, but then again, just talking about the leadership of the Claretians, that they're part of my life. And I gave you a picture. We were in a parade, and it was a Latino American parade, and we are holding American flags. Father Peter Rodriguez will encourage us to become U.S. citizens because he says there's a way to have a voice in this country, to have respect in this country. So all of these are from the Claretian, all is from the leadership of the priest that we had in St. Francis, okay?
Yeah.
St. Francis. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Byron?
Thank you so much, Deborah. This is just so beautiful and uplifting. As a Claretian, as an immigrant, helps a lot. Speaking of this, last night, with all the things happening in the parish, like the ministry, we had a Zoom meeting at around 9 p.m. with the leaders of the youth group, because we're facing, this immigration and ICE problems that's affecting the attendance, and they're affecting the families now. It's interesting that we continue. So I've been struggling a lot personally and as a minister about how are we, what's going to happen with, with our people in all this. We have the big celebration of St. Jude coming up next week, and I'm scared, but I talked to the leaders, to the youth group, and says well, this is the situation. What do we do? And Elena, I just want to tell you that spirit, that somehow, that it's you. One of the leaders at night, he says, well, if there's something that we have learned from you guys, from you Claretians, is that we fight. That we look for ways to help our kids, but this is the time in which, rather than closing or going virtual, we should see how to reach out to them. I was moved, and I just went down crying, because I never expected that our youth leaders would feel so empowered and supported by the mission that they want to fight, as they said, So, but something that actually, it's interesting now listening to Elena and to what you're saying in the presentation, is that they said, you Claretians don't give up. You support us, you work for the mission, so we believe in that. And that, that actually made my day. It was a full day, a busy day, and then I'm like, there is something greater than us here that's happening. So heaven knows, I think the next Deborah will have lots of stories to tell from these kids. And then now coming to this on the eve of the feast of St. Anthony Claret, it's just beautiful to see that there's a strong missionary spirit leading that's renewing, and that gives me hope. And I'm glad that our Claretians are working with our people, especially with Latinos, and now in this time and age, it's a whole different chapter. So thank you for this inspiration.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Hello, Deborah. I want to see if you can comment.
And you, I'm sorry, I don't think I know you.
No, I don't think anybody really does. I'm Edgar Guzman. I'm from California, Fresno, California, working at the St. Paul Catholic Center there. I'm the Latino Ministry Director, and here as the guest preacher for the Novena of St. Jude. So I'm very, very excited to be
Welcome.
here. Thank you, thank you. As we see, by me being here, but the Claretians too, it seems like they're not scared to work with lay people, to put them in power positions, and to give the people voices. Has that always been the case in your research? What did you see?
Pretty early, they were pretty on board with Vatican II, 1964 and on. The lay organizations at the Claretian parishes have been strong for a very long time. I can't tell you how many parishes across the country where I would find these photographs of the Santo Nombre, the Holy Name, the men, and the biggest group of people marching the streets of the Desfile Hispano in Perth Amboy in the 1950s is the Santo Nombre. What? So, and it was the same thing in San Antonio and whatever. And so that is all there. The Hoke existed earlier than Vatican II. I think that there was something. And and it's sort of interesting, with Chicago Católico, I was trying to tease out is sort of these rising voices and lay people's voices, how much this was Vatican II, how much of it was the Chicano movement, right? Which everybody was like, what's Chicano movement? And I'm like, it's Vatican II. But then I'm thinking like, oh, and it also has to do with some clerical leadership. So in this case, the Claretians. There were definitely a handful of other places and people in Chicago that were encouraging that. So that's a great question. And I think I teased it out. So the book gets messy but interesting when we get to Vatican II. Yeah.
I would do a follow-up comment with what you said, because a lot of the older guys, I know the stories they would tell me was partly we were so active in the Cursillo movement, and they would highlight how people who didn't exercise leadership in any place else in their world, they weren't educated, they became leaders in the Cursillo movement, and then they became leaders in the community. Like it was a training ground for their leadership.
For sure, yeah. Other questions or other stories? Hello.
Hello everyone, my name is Mike Buelas.
Oh gosh, hi, how are you? We had lunch like 3 years ago, I haven't seen him since then.
You all can call me Ish. So I have a question. So I've been looking at records of obviously Mexican taqueros and their movement across the Midwest and Chicago. And I was really interested in figuring out or understanding from your research how these Catholic priests were ending up in the smaller rural areas giving mass to Mexicans. Do you know there was like a word of mouth? Do you know there was the railroads reaching out to the ministries and asking them to come out to these little towns? And the reason why I ask is when I was doing my research, so for example, and it's not necessarily Catholic, right, but I was looking at the Ashton Gazette from 1945. Ashton is here in Illinois. It's a little small community. And they had Reverend Alden Coble, a special church service for Mexican track workers, and ended up being in the newspaper, right? So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, while I was mapping Mexican railroad workers in Illinois, there seemed to be a following of special Spanish language masses that ended up becoming in the English language newspaper of the 1920s, 1930s. So I was trying to figure out if you had run into that, whether it's in, I read the Católico, but in this one, since you cover a larger.
Right. Somebody else who wants to talk about traqueros all the time. So the Claretians, I think, were sort of very in touch. Like there was a lot of work in Texas. And when people decided they had enough with piscar algodón, with cotton picking, and they got jobs recruited by the railroads, I think the Claretians knew where they were going. So I think that is sometimes some of it. That case of Dodge City, there's, I think, a Paulist priest who's working up in Dodge City, and he's like, he met the Claretians in Texas. He's like, you guys are the ones we want. You speak Spanish. We want you guys to come up. So there was that. But also at the same time, so there's these just kind of linkages of priests who are working with this somewhat migratory population. There was also this super interesting thing out of Catholic Extension Society, which is an organization that still exists. Like maybe they're 2 blocks from here, right? They had a thing called the St. Peter's Chapel car. They had a railroad car that was outfitted as a mobile chapel. And there was a Claretian from Texas who in 1910, he's the one staffing the St. Peter's Chapel car as it's going through Kansas, the north of Texas, Oklahoma. Like, I just think there were kind of a variety of things. And I think there were a lot of people who were not served. I mean, there was like to serve all the people working in little railroad camps. I mean, that's like thousands of camps, right? So, and we do have good documentation in Chicago, and it was often the Claretians who were there, right? Because while the Claretians are setting up shop in South Chicago in 1925-26, and they're working with railroad car people there, right? We have a very famous photo of Father Tort and a Christmas party in front of a boxcar, but they're also going to like 5 different railroad camps around Chicago, like in neighborhoods that I'm like, what kind of neighborhood is this? 38th and whatever. Well, the reason I don't know what neighborhood is it because it would just be like railroads, right? And there was some kind of railroad encampment out by maybe O'Hare, right? And the Claretians were from South Chicago. Without driving, we're going to all of these places. So, and the Archbishop, Cardinal Munteline, he wanted them to go. He was like, I hope you're attending to all the Mexicans of Chicagoland. And they were like, we're in South Chicago. Like, we can't attend to all of them. So, yeah.
Besides the direct work that the Claretians have done with Spanish-speaking parishioners in various parts of the country, to what extent has their work indirectly affected other orders to do the surprisingly radical idea of speaking to people in their own language?
I think you have pockets of other religious congregations that are doing ministry in Spanish. There's always a Jesuit somewhere. I mean, like this early stuff, there's always a Jesuit who can, mission to some little pocket, right? But like the Jesuits overall, we're not doing Hispanic ministry. So, you had a few diocesan priests in Chicago in the early to mid 1950s who perceived that there was a need, and they perceived it was a need with Puerto Ricans. They were working with Puerto Ricans. Like, this is, again, sort of geographically mind-blowing. Puerto Ricans in Woodlawn? Like, huh?
Yeah.
Just south of the University of Chicago. Yes. And so we've got a couple diocesan priests who go out there. And they start to learn about Latin America by working with Puerto Ricans in Chicago. And, and then that ends up being quite impactful on the archdiocese as a whole. It's, I think I was fortunate in the course of researching this book, like how many different states did I attend Mass in? Like a lot. And, yes, it's one universal Catholic church, right? But like, boy, did churches have different flavors. Like there were some things going on in Texas that I did not, I was like, is this Catholic? Why do Catholic churches, I don't know, maybe I sound really ignorant. Why do Catholic churches have the 10 Commandments in front of their buildings in Texas? I mean, like, we don't do, like Chicago, the Midwest, we don't do that. I was just like, oh, because like every building in front of Texas and anywhere in Texas has to have the 10 Commandments, right? So I'm very surprised. But I just think the history of Hispanic ministry is a very piecemeal story across this country. And, about 3 years ago, I had a wonderful day at Catholic University in DC, and I got to do this great sort of sitting around a table with students at Catholic they were not college students. These were people who worked in ministry, who were getting their master's degrees and PhDs, right? So sisters and people in pastoral ministry and people who were in formation for the priesthood. So a variety. We're sitting around the table. I couldn't believe how many of them had stories of how nasty people were in their diocese to Latino people in like 2022, right? And like, when was it ever going to get better? And I was like, well, the Chicago story tells us that eventually, it takes time and, people need to be intentional and there needs to be leadership and things get better. And they're like, oh gosh, we sure hope that happens in New Hampshire or Kansas or wherever they were from. But, and it is a story of the entire, it's all of America, right? So.
I just said briefly, the only place I have been discriminated has been in a Catholic parish. Where the people, they were not Mexicans anymore, and the way it was Holy Cross and 46.
Back of the yards.
The way these persons that were walking into their mass were looking at us with so much hatred.
Sorry to hear.
They were saying that it was their parish, and they would look at us with so pain.
And so interesting, somebody who I invited, but I don't think he's here today. He's Placido's nephew, David Rodriguez, who's a Spanish professor at UIC. And he grew up there. And he went to the grade school there. He's Mexican American. He was born in Perth Amboy. Because of Father Thomas, I mean, there's just like weird connections there. But he grew up at a Holy Cross school.
Lithuanian.
And like all this, like, oh, we all got along great. That was his growing up youth story. So, but adults sometimes had different experiences. Yeah.
Already Mexicans said 12 o'clock mass, and they were coming for the 1 o'clock mass.
Right.
They went back because the way they look at me, I didn't need that.
Yeah. So maybe if we have one more comment or question, and then we can, or we could just get conversational. So, shall we do that? So this was a really wonderful formal conversation, and I'm always glad to hear that people, like, my books make them cry. So somebody else has told me that. So, I'm going to hang out in the back and sign books for people, but please, there's coffee and juice and nice things to enjoy. And I think we have the room. I don't know what time it is. We have the room for the next hour? Is that?
We have the room.
Okay.
It's my building. We have the room. Just let me
Okay.
All right. Make one comment before we give a good round of applause, and thank you to Deborah E. And I don't know, the historians will have to tell me, I don't know if this story I'm about to share might be apocryphal, but it was one that I heard as Claretians, was the first Claretian to come to Chicago and investigate whether we would do ministry here was Juan Maistegui, who would become a bishop in Panama as well. And so the story, which could be apocryphal, was he came out and visited, and he sent a telegram back to Los Angeles that said, "Send 100 Claretians immediately." Yeah. And I like this story because I want to highlight is we're not a historical organization. We are a current living organization that has inherited a legacy and a spirit that we do not want to do a disservice to. So the constant questions of what do we need to do, how do we need to do it, what languages do we need to learn, where do we need to go, is still very much something we embrace, but it's also one of those things that both motivates and shames you as well to fill up, to follow in the shoes and continue to not talk about the good old days, but to build a better future. And so again, thank you to Deborah.